Before Missouri erupted into open civil war in 1861, violence had already taken root along its western border. The conflict we now call Bleeding Kansas was not a side story. It was not a prelude happening somewhere else. It was one of the clearest warnings of what Missouri's future would look like. What happened in Kansas Territory was shaped by national laws, but it was carried out by real people. Settlers, activists, armed partisans, and Missouri border men who understood that the future of Kansas might also shape the future of Missouri. In this episode, we're going to follow that escalation: the election fraud, the border interference, the rise of the so-called border ruffians, the sacking of Lawrence, the Pottawatomie killings, and the Lecompton Constitution crisis. What began as a political struggle over slavery became something far more unstable. It became a border war. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law in 1854, it did more than organize a new territory. It opened a contest. Kansas would no longer be shaped by the old boundaries set in 1820. Instead, the question of slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty, in other words, by the people who settled there. That sounds simple enough, at least on paper. Let the settlers decide. But from the beginning, almost nobody treated Kansas like a neutral political experiment. For anti-slavery Northerners, Kansas represented a chance to stop slavery from spreading further west. For pro-slavery Missourians, Kansas represented a threat. If Kansas entered the Union as a free state, Missouri would sit directly beside free territory. That mattered politically. It mattered economically. And for many slave-holding Missourians, it mattered emotionally. So people moved in. Some came to settle. Some came to influence. Some came armed. And almost immediately, the process was corrupted. One of the defining features of Bleeding Kansas was that elections, supposedly the peaceful way to settle the issue, were compromised almost from the beginning. Missouri bordermen crossed into Kansas in large numbers to vote in territorial elections, often without any legal claim to residence there. These men were not just casual observers. Many came specifically to ensure that Kansas would become a slave state. Some of them were organized. Some were loosely coordinated. Some were simply swept up in the moment. But together, they helped create a political atmosphere in which fraud, intimidation, and force became normal tools. These pro-slavery activists became widely known as border ruffians. The name stuck because it captured the reputation they earned: armed Missourians crossing the line, bullying Poles, threatening free state settlers, and shaping Kansas politics through fear as much as through votes. Now, to be fair, the Kansas conflict was not one-sided forever. Anti-slavery settlers and organizations also mobilized, organized, and sometimes armed themselves in response. But Missouri's role in the early phase of the conflict was unmistakable. Missouri was not watching Bleeding Kansas from a distance. Missouri was helping drive it. That matters because it shows how thin the line already was between political conflict and organized violence. If ballots could be manipulated, if outsiders could flood the polls, if intimidation could shape law, then the next step became easier to imagine. And in Kansas, that next step came quickly.
If this story feels unfinished, that's because it is. The Missouri in the Crossfire series goes deeper into the people, the decisions, and the chaos that reshaped Missouri during the Civil War. Find the full series at mostcivilwar.website/books.
As election fraud and intimidation mounted, Kansas Territory began to split politically. Pro-slavery and free state factions increasingly rejected each other's legitimacy. Each side claimed to represent the true will of the settlers. Each side accused the other of corruption and bad faith. What emerged was not just disagreement, but parallel political realities. Free state settlers built their own institutions and challenged pro-slavery territorial authority. Pro-slavery leaders, backed in part by fraudulent elections and outside influence, insisted they were the legal government. At that point, trust was gone. Once a political system loses legitimacy in the eyes of large portions of the people living under it, violence becomes much easier to justify. And in Kansas, both sides were moving toward that edge. On May 21, 1856, the conflict reached a new level. Lawrence, Kansas, was one of the leading strongholds of the Free State movement. To pro-slavery forces, it was more than a town. It was a symbol. That day, pro-slavery men entered Lawrence and sacked the town. Printing presses tied to the Free State cause were destroyed. Buildings were attacked. Property was damaged. The purpose was not subtle. This was punishment. It was intimidation made public. And Missouri border men were heavily involved. That detail matters. The violence in Lawrence was not just internal to Kansas. It reflected the long reach of Missouri's border politics into the territory. The sacking of Lawrence became national news. It hardened opinions, deepened outrage, and convinced many anti-slavery observers that the conflict in Kansas could no longer be understood as a fair political contest. To them, the message was clear. If pro-slavery forces could not win cleanly, they would use force. 3 days later, retaliation came. On the night of May 24th into May 25th, 1856, John Brown and a small group of abolitionist followers carried out what became known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. 5 pro-slavery men were pulled from their homes and killed. Brown believed he was responding to the violence at Lawrence and striking fear into the pro-slavery movement. But whatever he intended, the effect was immediate and profound. The conflict had crossed another threshold. This was no longer just mob destruction, election fraud, or intimidation at the polls. This was murder as political retaliation. And once that line had been crossed, the logic of revenge became even harder to stop. Pottawatomie shocked the country. It also deepened the sense that Kansas, and the Missouri border beside it, had become a place where national arguments were being settled through bloodshed. This is one of the reasons Bleeding Kansas matters so much to Missouri's story. Because it revealed, before the Civil War officially began, how quickly violence could become personal, retaliatory, and cyclical.
For deeper context, primary sources, and battlefield guides tied to this episode, visit moscivilwar.website. It's a growing archive of Missouri's Civil War, battles, people, and places, all in one place.
By 1857 and 1858, the conflict had moved back into politics, but the violence and distrust never really disappeared. One of the central controversies of this period was the Lecompton Constitution. This proposed constitution would have brought Kansas into the Union as a slave state. To supporters, it was a legal step toward stability. To opponents, it was a fraud, shaped by pro-slavery influence, backed by a political system already discredited by earlier interference and intimidation. Missouri's political influence loomed over this controversy. The Lecompton struggle wasn't just about Kansas settlers debating their future. It was also about whether Missouri-linked pro-slavery power would help force a slave state outcome on a deeply divided territory. The issue exploded nationally. Even within the Democratic Party, Lecompton created fractures. The crisis showed that Kansas was no longer a regional problem. It had become a national test of whether slavery could be expanded through manipulated politics backed by force. In the end, the Lecompton Constitution failed. But by then, the damage had been done. Kansas had already shown the country what the future might look like when compromise broke down and both sides came to believe the stakes were too high to lose. Bleeding Kansas mattered because it exposed something the country still wanted to deny. The struggle over slavery would not stay confined to speeches, votes, and legislation. It would spill into towns, homes, printing presses, polling places, and roads. And for Missouri, the lesson was even more immediate. The border was no shield. Missouri men were involved. Missouri politics were involved. Missouri fears and ambitions were involved. What happened in Kansas was not separate from Missouri's history. It was part of it. Before Missouri erupted into open civil war, it had already seen the shape that conflict might take: fraud, armed partisans, retaliation, civilian fear, and communities pushed into opposing camps. The future had already appeared once on the border. In our next episode, we move forward into Phase 2, Missouri erupts. The long tension of the 1820s, the failed compromises of the 1850s, and the violence of bleeding Kansas now give way to open conflict. Missouri will no longer be standing beside the storm. It will be inside it. This is Missouri in the crossfire, and the border is burning.